If you look at the polls over, let's say, the last 2 months, what you'll see is that Harris has consistently been in the lead. The betting polls are saying something very different. Things could be especially difficult or volatile, I think, over the next couple of months prior to the inauguration. Going into the next administration, no matter who's president, I think inflation hedges will make sense.
But do you see the markets continuing to march a little bit higher?
Well, they could, especially I think with the Trump election, they would continue to march higher.
It's on everyone's mind right now, the presidential election and how things will play out. I'm your host, Andrew Brill. We'll talk about the election and some of the issues affecting all of us. And if you need help with your finances moving forward, head over to Wealthion.com/free for a free, no obligation financial review. I'd like to welcome back our partner investment advisor, Chris Casey, who is a founder and managing director of WindRock. Chris, welcome back. It's certainly an interesting time we live in right now, isn't it?
It certainly is. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see you again.
So we're going to talk a little bit about, or a lot of bit about the upcoming election and what it all means. And I'd like to start, Chris, by asking you about the polls. Now, there's two different polls that we hear about, or I guess a few different polls that we hear about, but one of them is a national poll, and then you'll also hear about betting polls. And I want to differentiate between the two because they are very different.
Well, they're very different by as far as the mechanism by how they come up with the results, but they're also very different in what they're saying right now. And it's been a bit of a roller coaster. If you look at the polls over, let's say, the last 2 months, what you'll see is that Harris has consistently been in the lead, and maybe it's narrowed a little bit, but they still call Harris the winner on a very tight type of election. The betting polls are saying something very different. They've changed dramatically since the conventions. They were heavily in favor of Trump, obviously, after the assassination attempt. And now they're finally, over the last 3 weeks, they've moved decidedly in Trump's favor again. So what you've seen is anywhere from October 1st, really took off, I'd say October 7th. And now you see Trump widening a lead where pretty dramatically, where it's almost, we're talking landslide type predictions coming out of several different betting websites and kind of a 60-40 type popular vote, or at least the odds are of him winning.
Is this something new where there's betting sites that are all of a sudden taking bets on who's going to win the presidency?
They're not new per se, but they're becoming more popular. Like you've been able to bet on London for quite some time, but now you have a number of markets. Not all of them are open to Americans. However, it's easy to get around that as well. But the reason betting polls, I think, make a lot more sense is because no one is giving a false answer. You pick up the phone and someone calls you. You could say whatever. You just want to get off the phone. Maybe they call you twice. Hey, you give the same answer twice. Well, when you're putting money down, that's your actual deep felt conviction, whether it's for that person, meaning you're in favor of that candidate, or because you just can see the way the wind's blowing and you believe that person will win, actually. So I think the betting polls in general give more accurate answers, and they're becoming more popular. I think there's a lot more attention on them right now, which I think is a good thing.
Oh, I bet the Commanders yesterday to win on a Hail Mary pass, and that was actually brutal because I was watching that game, but well, I digress. And you being in Chicago, probably reading all about that today in the newspapers. But how has this all changed? July 21st will go down in our history as a very, very big day, because that's the day that Joe Biden decided that he wasn't going to run any longer. He was going to pass the reins off to Kamala Harris. And it was Trump in a landslide at that point, and I think it caught his campaign a little off guard, and it probably caught a lot of people off guard that he did that, even though there were a lot of people calling for Biden to step aside. But what's changed in that time period from July 21st to now, where it's, in essence, too close to call because all the polls have it within that margin of error?
Well, first of all, please don't bring up the Bears anymore on this program. But there was a heartache. I'm outside Chicago, obviously, so there was a hard game to watch. So I think I said on a previous podcast with you that, in my opinion, the candidate who would win would be the one that avoided the most missteps. Because, face it, both these candidates have a lot of flaws as far as in ability to have gaffes or missteps, what have you. And Trump, I think, has had a couple, but they've been fairly early on. So going back to the assassination attempt, right, a few days later, he had the Republican National Convention. He is on a high note, right? I think that was his first misstep, was the acceptance speech he gave. It was no different than any of his other, like, rally type speeches where it's a lot off the cuff. He's calling people out of the audience. What he should have done, in my opinion, and I think would have really solidified him, was a very dignified so-called presidential speech. He basically could have just done a replay of his inauguration address, which was very un-Trump-like. It was a great speech. It's just not something he normally does. And he stuck to a script, right? That was one misstep. The other was the debate he did with Harris. And while I say neither one did well, I think people would say that she won only because he did so poorly. And you saw that from the first answer, right? She didn't answer it. He could have easily really won some points right there with his retort, and he didn't. And it's like a lot of debates he's done, he just seems unprepared. Now, the Harris campaign has been in a bind, right? Because they don't have what I would say is a good overall message, right? The message is we're not Trump. We're not the ones banning abortion. And we're the agent of change, which is a really odd position to be in when you're part of the current administration, right? So I think the Harris candidacy has had more missteps, namely some disastrous interviews, whether it's the 60 Minutes interview, the allegations of it being heavily, not even edited, beyond that, manipulated. You also have the interview she did with Fox with, I believe his name is Brett Baer. Disastrous, right? They should have never, ever allowed her to do that. I'm not sure who's calling the shots on that. And the other thing that I think Trump has done well, and I'll just digress for a minute and tell the story. A couple of years ago, in the early years of his administration, I remember seeing this economist I know, and he was later part of the administration on and off. He had mentioned, listen, Trump is the nicest guy in the world privately and one of the meanest publicly, right? And so what the campaign has done is really showed him to be more of the affable guy that people get to see when they're intimate with him, right? So that McDonald's thing, I think, was huge. Not so much because they're calling out what they believe to be a lie on the Harris side, but more so it just shows him like an affable, nice guy, right? He's just interacting with common people, which he's very good at. It's the reason he was in Hollywood and entertainment for a long time. So I think they've managed the campaign much better and avoided some of the missteps that the Harris campaign has done.
That McDonald's appearance has led to some pretty cool memes, a lot of them. And I guess that's one of the things you try to avoid when you're doing something like that. Although you're trying to show, I guess, the American people that you're an average American. And look, I too can work at McDonald's, although I don't know how long he was there, and I don't think he was working the fryer. But it's just one of those things where he was trying to show that he was that type of person that we don't get to see. None of us really spend time with Donald Trump behind closed doors to get the real Donald Trump, if you will. But there's a lot of issues, Chris, that have come up, and in your investment world and the customers that you talk to, I'd like to get a sense of what people are talking to you about, with what they're worried about over the next 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, because the issues that, depending on if you're talking to Republicans or Democrats, obviously with Trump, they're talking about the economy. They're talking about immigration. Interestingly enough, because I looked it up, violent crime was the third thing that Republican voters are concerned about. And on the Harris side, they're worried about health care. They're actually worried about the Supreme Court nominees. Obviously, overturning Roe v. Wade is a big thing in that. And third on the list is the economy. So are your customers, your clients, talking to you about, hey, look, I need my investments to do this because this is what I'm worried about?
Well, we probably have a skewed, sample of the public at large, only because our clients tend to be pretty knowledgeable about a lot of things, and they're a little bit more investment focused. So we probably won't have conversations with them about the border or what have you. But I could tell you that all of them, and I think this is prudent, and this is something that all investors in America, all American citizens should be concerned about, is really the debt situation, because I don't see any candidate doing anything about it when they're in office. Now, Trump was just on Joe Rogan, and one of the things I recall him saying was that through his tax initiatives, what have you, he anticipated them as being able to starting to pay down the debt in the last year when COVID hit. And then he said, well, we had to spend, because it was COVID affecting everything, right? Well, that's just not possible, right? The deficits are just too large with or without national emergency. They're not going away. It's structural. It's a structural problem with entitlements. It's a problem with the debt levels, with interest rates. So the primary focus, I think, of everyone's what their investment outlook should be is how to protect yourself from inflation, because that's the only way they're going to get out of this debt mess is to continue inflate the money supply. It's the only way out outside of an outright default, which of course they would never do.
So in looking at the tax plans or looking at the plans for each candidate, I've done some reading. It looked like candidate Harris is going to increase the debt over the next 10 years by $3.5 trillion. And candidate Trump is going to increase the debt by $7.5 trillion over the next 10 years. So your point to the debt is, a good one in that, add $7.5 trillion or $3.5 trillion. So you're talking about, nearly 40 to nearly 40.5 trillion. And we have to service that debt. And the bond market, for some reason, has been going up as the Fed cuts interest rate. So how do we get this under control? We could inflate it, which is what Donald Trump seems to think we can do, or try to deflate it, which is what Harris wants to do. But either way, the spending isn't going to stop, and it could create problems.
Oh, absolutely. It will create problems. Interest rates have gone up, most notably on the long end, right? You've seen the 10-year go from, let's call it 3.6% or so to I believe 4.2. And a lot of people have cited that as what you're talking about is that Trump may spend more than Harris. Personally, I don't see how that's possible. I think they're both going to spend a lot. I don't really see a big difference between the candidates in that regard. So the long end, and I think what that is, it's a reflection that at some point the treasury markets will start to be concerned about the solvency of the United States, because we've talked about this before, but when you have 35 trillion in debt and you bring in 4.5 trillion in revenue, there's no way you can even meet your own needs as far as the annual budget, let alone start paying down debt. It's never going to happen. I can't see it without some dramatic political maneuvers as far as entitlements, what have you. So, both candidates will spend a lot. I absolutely see that. And I think the bond market is starting to reflect that.
And well, let's get it. We'll talk about tariffs in a minute. I want to get into the battleground states, and they all seem to have something in common. There seems to be 7 battleground states that will really decide this election. Most states stick to whether they're red or they're blue, but there's a few that can be flipped to Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona. I think I missed North Carolina in there somewhere, but I think those are the 7. Are there similarities with those states that create this battleground situation?
Yeah, I think so. Because you look at them geographically and they have some commonalities, right? You have, on the one hand, you have a block in the Deep South. On the other hand, you have a Midwestern block. And then you also have the Southwestern block as far as Nevada and Arizona. So I'm sure immigration is a big one for those Southwestern states. As far as the Midwestern states, I'm sure that and this is part of the reason I believe Trump picked J.D. Vance, right? Because Ohio now is firmly under Republican control as far as the polls show, whereas Wisconsin's even up for grabs. That was unheard of a couple years ago.
Right.
And I think Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they're more concerned about 2 things. One would be tariffs and any kind of trade policies, because there's a lot of union areas up there, auto workers, what have you. And secondly would be, I think, fracking. Obviously, with Pennsylvania, that's a big deal with the Marcellus shale field, which is like covers 2/3 of the state. So I think that's another key issue there. I'm not sure to completely answer your question, what the motivations would be as far as Georgia and North Carolina, but there have been, obviously, they've been borderline or border ground states for years now. So I think there are some commonalities between the others.
It's interesting, and this wasn't on our list of topics to talk about, but when we talk about fracking and energy, oil is now, because Israel decided they weren't going to blow up Iran's oil fields or stuff like that, oil has actually come down. So it seems like that might be a little less of an issue. You know that OPEC and those nations will try and pick that back up. But it seems right now oil is down, and I know that fracking is a big deal. They want to bring it down further. The cost of energy they'd like to bring down further. But that seems like right now not such a big deal. But once energy prices start going up, it will be, won't it?
You could make an argument that oil's recent fall may not be so much geopolitical as it is political, meaning maybe they're really looking at the outcome of this election. That could be a big argument, in that they see Trump as winning and that he's going to drill, baby, drill, right? And there's some other signs I think point to that. Most telling would be the fact that the Washington Post and LA Times refused to endorse Harris, right? That's a big deal. And it's also a big deal along those same lines that other media has come out and openly attacked her for not being sitting down for an interview. So, for instance, Time Magazine recently did that. They criticized her to say, we have an open invitation. We have interviewed every presidential candidate for X number of years. You refuse to come on. They did that publicly, which is a bit shocking. It's especially shocking because that's probably the friendliest interview she could ever get, right? It's kind of like Brezhnev being interviewed by Pravda, right? It's fantastic. So I do think maybe oil has sold off a bit. It may be a sign, one of many, I think, that create like a mosaic that would predict a Trump victory.
Hi, everyone. I'm one of your hosts here at Wealthion, Andrew Brill. In these weird economic times where the market is up, then it could go down, a lot of people calling for a correction. Some people think it's just going to keep going up. But if you need help being financially resilient, head over to wealthion.com/free, and we'll give you a free, no obligation. We don't expect anything from you. We'll just help you evaluate your portfolio and let you know what we can do to help. Again, head over to wealthion.com/free for a free, no obligation portfolio review, and let us do the heavy lifting for you. So let's get to the tariffs for a second and talk about taxes versus tariffs. Chris, how do we protect ourselves? Obviously, tariffs are going to create one issue. Taxes will create a different issue. Now, tariffs, Trump says, well, the countries pay the tariffs, and it's actually not. It's the tariffs on the imported goods. So the company here in the United States that's importing those goods from those countries, it's actually paying the tariffs, which will filter down to the American people in higher prices, won't it?
Absolutely. I think you're referring, there may have been more coverage on this, but I just know from the recent Joe Rogan interview that Joe Rogan insinuated, hey, have you even thought about replacing the income tax with tariffs? And Trump was like, yeah, it's on the table, was basically his answer. No tax is perfectly neutral. No tax is without its repercussions, the misallocations they cause. However, I'm a little bit intrigued by doing something like this. You may remember, for the first 100 years of this country's existence, that was really the only source of revenue. It almost led to secession by the northern states several times over this issue, right? That's how strong the issue of tariffs was back then, because it definitely impacted the southern states negatively relative to the northern. So one thing to keep in mind, though, is that everyone talks about so-called sin taxes, right? Taxes on alcohol and tobacco, and everyone agree, well, that's to diminish demand for those products. Well, what do you think happens when you have taxes on income, right? It diminishes, the incentive. Now, people would say, well, I'm still going to work because I want to make a certain amount of money. That's true, but it's not a tax on the wealthy. It's a tax on people trying to get wealthy, the income tax, right? That's what really makes it a problem. It impedes social mobility for people to get rich, right? Because a lot of tax people like Trump, like Elon, they have paid a lot of taxes, but it's not from a big salary, right? So whenever they have to sell a stock, and they'll pay lower taxes. So they've paid a lot in absolute terms, but compared to probably a lot of people that are, I'd say in the middle class, they're paying probably a lot more on percentage basis. So no tax is perfect, but the income tax, you could argue, is one of the worst possible taxes that could exist, right? I would argue the only one worse, I'm going off topic here, would be the inheritance tax, and it's pretty meaningless to government revenues. It's pretty small, but I just find it offensive that someone dies and wants to give someone else money, and that the government feels that it's okay to come in and take a big take of it, right? Just, it's, in my mind, it's silly.
And that money, you've paid taxes on that money already, because that's money that someone earned and put away and paid the tax on that money. And now the government says, well, they died, so we get our piece also. So it's like
Right.
being double taxed. So I hear you in that respect, and it's upsetting. Now, what about the capital gains, Chris? And I know that you this is your business. This is what you deal with. Kamala Harris is talking about long-term capital gains going from 20% to 28%. Look, if you're a savvy investor like WindRock is, and you're smart about what you're doing, 20% is a pretty big chunk already. To up that by another 8% on us people that are just trying to make extra money with the money we've already paid taxes on, it seems a little unreasonable.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, I'm in favor of zero capital gains tax. There's really no reason for it. It creates a misallocation of capital. It also impedes social mobility on people that maybe start businesses or what have you. So I think it's a horrible idea. But going from 20 to 28 isn't nearly as bad as her proposed policy of taxing unrealized capital gains. That is, now I never think that would be enacted, because at best, I think we're looking at a split Congress. And also, you're always going to get Democrats who are reasonable and say this is a ridiculous idea, right? Basically the equivalent of like West Virginia senator, right? They're going to have a lot of people that just balk at this because it doesn't make it fails a common sense test. But if that was to happen, or even if there's a threat of it happening, that would have a very pronounced chilling effect on a number of different investments, primarily venture capital, right? Because everything there is based on appreciation and capital gains over a period of time. So, yes, increasing the capital gains tax is bad, but I'm almost a sigh of relief as long as it's not an unrealized capital gains tax.
What about the proposed billionaires tax? Now, I don't know how many it was before, but right now there's about 750 billionaires in the United States. I'm not one of them, so this won't apply to me. But there is a proposal on the table to have a billionaires tax. Look, I think that if people pay their fair share, you shouldn't go after them further. But it's a matter of paying your fair share, whether it be an individual or a corporation.
Yeah, that sounds like a horrible idea too. I mean, for a number of reasons. First of all, it strikes me as unconstitutional just from an equal protection clause of the Constitution, right? I don't see how you can go after someone just because their net worth happens to be more than someone else's. But it's also important to remember, because it's easy to sell anything when you're talking about the so-called rich, right? So the income tax in 1913, that's how they build it. It came out, and it's like, well, don't worry about it. It only affects 1% of the population. And it did for a very limited amount of time. And then all of a sudden, obviously today, those tentacles reach everything. So when anyone talks about this is a very limited scope, it only targets the rich, I always view that as a distinct red flag. And I think this case is no different.
So have you noticed distinct differences in the two plans? I don't know if you've studied them, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot a little bit. But between the two economic plans that you see could be a red flag for investors?
Absolutely. And I actually did that last week. I went through each campaign's website and read all their so-called policy proposals. Harris has some now. I think the last time we talked, there was
That's
nothing
right.
there. Let me just kind of generally summarize, and I'll tell you what I notice about him. On hers, it's mostly kind of two things. It's a free giveaway, right? It's everything from tax credits or breaks for instance, starting a new business or buying a new home. Well, obviously, she's never started a new business, because new businesses generally don't need a tax break because they're not paying taxes for a couple of years because they're probably losing money, right? So it doesn't really I would say those are fairly immaterial proposals that don't really move the needle. The other overall theme was a hostility, I'd say, to the free market determination of prices. So whether it's the well-known price gouging proposal against pharmaceuticals, maybe it's in disaster areas, maybe it's prescriptions. She's calling for a price cap. There's antitrust. She's proposing more robust. I don't know how you get this. We already have a really pretty bad FCC right now overseeing any kind of mergers, but she would be worse. I mean, she's already called out, hey, it's grocery stores. You can't do any mergers right now because they're going to consolidate and, raise prices. So it's a very misguided. I think the overall theme is that there's a very misguided understanding to basic economics. Now, Trump is somewhat similar, and he has a potpourri of offering somebody for everything, right? It's okay, no tips, tips aren't taxed. It's all over the place. But in general, they're more concrete proposals, right? It's going to say what they're going to do exactly. And I think they are, on the whole, far more beneficial. And they're not hostile to the free market because he has a basic understanding, being a businessman, of how it works.
Yeah, there's all of these, I should say there's a lot of people that complain that corporations don't pay their fair share, or there's corporations that don't pay enough, or there's tax breaks for corporations. How do we get around that? You have Trump, who wants to lower the corporate tax rate to 15% and use tariffs, whatever those might be, to make up the revenue. But you have lower income people who under Trump are going to end up paying more in taxes, whereas higher income people will get, in essence, a tax break or pay less in taxes. But the percentage that lower income people are going to pay under Trump is actually more than the higher income people. So how do we justify this?
Well, I don't know if that's exactly true. I mean, I've seen the headlines on that too. It's all over the Harris campaign because they talk about all of her points, and then they always do like a foil of what Trump would do. And under Trump, you're going to pay $4,000 more, but with us, you won't. That kind of thing. So I'm not sure I haven't seen that apart from, like, for instance, her website. As far as lowering the corporate income tax, I think it's a great idea. America has a very high income tax corporate-wise when you compare it to any other country or most countries in the world. Now, in general, I hate that type of comparison because normally it's used to make things worse here, right? It's like, well, they have socialized medicine in England. Why don't we have it here, right? Well, thank God we don't have it here. Make it worse. So in general, I don't like that comparison, but it is insightful that you see that, yes, we're taxing our companies more so than anyone else. And all that means is we're taxing shareholders and investors. That's all that means. It doesn't mean anything else. So I think lowering the corporate tax would be great. And you're right. He has talked about going down to 15%.
So let's talk about the election itself. And it is close. And we all remember what happened in 2020 and the talk about stealing the election, talk about this. Chris, explain to me how someone does get elected president, because we look at the national polls, say, oh, you know what? Harris is leading, I think, by 1.7 points or percentage. It's very, very close. And that 1.7 is within the margin of error. But I don't even know why they do national polls, because they don't mean anything. And I know you've written a paper on the 12th Amendment, which is exactly how we elect a president in this country. So educate me, please.
Yeah, I would say that, well, first of all, just to put it in perspective, focusing on who's ahead nationally is kind of like focusing on who may score more runs in the World Series. It doesn't necessarily translate in who's winning, right? Because you could win one game 10-1 and you lose the rest of them by, one run for each game thereafter, right? So it is a bit misleading. So much better way is to look at it from a battleground perspective always. And things could get messy. I mean, the problem is that after the 2020 election, I think what that really did was expose the flaws in the system. There's a couple flaws. One, there's no remedy if someone believes there was actual cheating done, right? There's very little things. So what's the judge going to do? He's not able to tell you if some Dominion machine was actually tampered with. But more importantly, is the tight time frame that we have between the election and the inauguration and the steps that happen in between it as far as certifying electors, what have you. It's an extremely tight time frame, to the point where you may remember from the Gore Bush election with the Florida issue with the hanging
Hanging
Chad,
Chads.
right? The issue there was that the Florida Supreme Court, I believe, was the court that demanded that they have recounts, I think, in 4 counties, and anywhere else where there was some certain discrepancies were found. And the reality is, Florida could not adhere to that timeline. There's no way they could do it and get their slate of electors submitted to Congress and certified in time. So that's really fundamentally the issue, is that there's no remedy, but maybe there could be if we had more time. It's just a very tight time frame.
One of these candidates is obviously going to be elected president, unless there's a lot of people that write someone in that gets elected. What kind of policy changes are we looking at day 1, day 2, or within the first 100 days that would affect investors like you and I?
Well, it's difficult to say. I'd say with Harris as president, there would be less of a so-called 100 days, a lot done there. And it's primarily just because I don't think Congress is going to flip where it's going to be all Democrat, right? I think at least Republicans retain the Senate or have the Senate. And I think they may retain the House as well. So I think she would be looking at Congress that's run by the opposite party. For Trump, if the same situation arises, he will obviously have a lot more ability to do things. And a lot of this could be done via executive order. So regardless who's president, you could address the border, right? There's things you could do right there. Foreign policy, obviously, you're going to see some marked changes depending on who's in office. But as far as the first 100 days, if you have a cooperating Congress for Trump, I think tax legislation is going to be one of the first things, because in his mind, cutting taxes and spurring productivity and spurring economic growth is the key to reducing the deficit, ultimately the debt. He feels like that's the best way to make America competitive. I think he would aggressively go after a tax. And we saw this before in 2016, right? This is one of the first things he did was push a pretty sweeping tax legislation that we got in his first term.
How are we protecting ourselves, Chris? Where are we putting our money? If you get the investor call and you say, "Help me! What am I doing? I'm in disarray here, and I need your help."
Well, things can be especially difficult or volatile, I think, over the next couple of months prior to the inauguration, because we can have a number of things. We can have a tie, for all we know. We could have unheard of things that have happened before. So, for instance, we could have a slate of electors that's not certified in the safe harbor time period, and maybe Congress won't accept it. We could have what they call faithless electors who switch their votes, and maybe that could move from a close race to push someone over the edge. Who knows? There's a lot of things like that that could happen and could raise a lot of issues. So I think being very liquid over the next few months makes a lot of sense. Going into the next administration, no matter who's president, I think inflation hedges will make sense because we talked about the debt situation and, no end to the spending that's going to take place. So there we're looking at precious metals. I think you should look at cryptocurrencies, farmland. Any exporting company that makes their money exporting out of the U.S., I think would do well under that circumstance. And you're looking for any kind of real estate that has tenants, because it's to protect yourself. So I think overall, no matter who is president, you're looking at inflation hedges first and foremost.
So the bottom line is we're going to have a new president come November 5th. Actually, we'll have a new president in January, but we'll have one elected November 5th, we think. What happens in the event of a tie, Chris?
Oh, boy, it gets really messy. I mean, there's a lot of steps to even get there. But theoretically, if you did, then you have the House of Representatives actually elect the president. And most people think, well, it's going to be really tight, right? Because the Republicans have a slim majority. But they don't vote like they do for any kind of legislation. They vote as a state. So you get 50 votes right there. And if you look at, if you go through all the congressional political affiliations for Congress by state, you'll see that I believe Republicans control 27 of them, so majority. And I think there's 2 ties, one being North Carolina. I can't recall the other. So this could very well be a contested re-election that goes to Congress. In that event, too, you have the Senate then picks the vice president. Now, if they're unable to decide, and that's a very real possibility, right? They could be deadlocked, could go on for some time. We saw this with, although the 12th Amendment was around at the same time, we saw this with Thomas Jefferson. We saw it in 1876 with Hayes and Tilden Jennings. We've seen this before, right? So it could go on. And if it goes on post inauguration, then automatically Kamala Harris would become the president by virtue of being the vice president right now. While that's getting sorted out, she would be acting president.
Can we just say that's not going to happen? That is a mess.
Well, I hope we don't have a mess because, frankly, one of the arguments for democracy is for a peaceful transition of power. And if you don't have that, well, then what are we doing, right? Like that's one of the keys they always laud democracy as being able to do is have this peaceful. Well, if that no longer is the case, then we have real issues. So I really hope it's clear cuts. And I do think there should be some reforms on the table for future elections, because whether it's a timeline, whether it's a method by which disgruntled candidates can air their grievances about so-called election fraud, that's really should be what happens to prevent this ever again from happening in the future.
Do you see the market continue to hit new highs? Obviously, gold, precious metals are on the rise. Gold and silver, as you said, they're hedges against inflation, against disarray in the markets. But do you see the markets continuing to march a little bit higher?
Well, they could, especially I think with the Trump election, they would continue to march higher. And that's just because, large part, the investment community tends to favor Trump. I just saw that in a poll in Barron's. So it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of hedge funds and stuff, kind of jump back into the markets. However, I'm less enthusiastic. I think we could be very well in a recession as we speak. If that's the case, it's only a matter of time before those cracks really start appearing, and whether it's in corporate earnings, whether it's in employment numbers, what have you. But I think there's going to be some cracks. And so while things seem okay right now, there's a lot of complacency out there. I'd be very defensive in how I'd be positioned within the bond and stock markets.
Well, there you have it, Chris. I appreciate you coming on. I always appreciate your expertise, and I know this is one of those areas that you're well versed in, because this is right up your professor alley. So I thank you for coming. I appreciate your time, and we'll see what happens on November 5th.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for watching our discussion here on Wealthion with Chris of WindRock Wealth Management. If you need help being financially resilient, please head over to wealthion.com/free for a free, no obligation financial review. It would most likely be Chris getting back to you. And of course, if you could like and subscribe to the channel, we greatly appreciate it. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you know when we post new videos on the channel. And please, do the social media thing with us. All the links are below in the description. And if you like this content and are looking for more ways to achieve long-term wealth, watch this video next. Until next time, stay informed, be empowered, and may your investments flourish.